1. Nathaniel Jamar Abraham. At 11 years old, Nathaniel Jamar Abraham lived in Pontiac, Michigan, a slender black boy known more for his struggles than any violent reputation. He was a student, frequently quiet and withdrawn, living with his mother in a troubled household. His family environment was unstable. His father had abandoned them soon after he was born, and his mother juggled long night shift work as a lab technician. Socially, Nathaniel was isolated. He was not seen as dangerous before the incident. He was just a child who lacked support and whose needs fell through the cracks. What triggered the tragedy, Nathaniel had previously been suspected in a number of minor incidents, broken windows, petty theft fights, but had never been formally charged. His IQ was assessed around 70 with cognitive processing, similar to that of a 7-year-old. Emotional understanding and impulse control were significantly delayed. The school and social system offered little help. He practiced target shooting days before the incident, telling a girlfriend with alarming clarity, "I'm going to shoot somebody." These were not the words of bravado, but cries misread as threats. On one afternoon outside a party store, Nathaniel picked up a stolen .22 caliber rifle. He was more than 200 feet away from the 18-year-old victim, shooting at trees, or so he said. But one of his shots struck the young man in the head. The victim stood outside that store, a stranger to Nathaniel, and died in the hospital the following day. Nathaniel later provided conflicting stories to police at times, claiming he shot at trees, at other times conceding he fired toward people. His emotional display was tearful, bewildered, appearing lost in the court hearings, dressed in oversized garb that made him look smaller than he already was. Police and prosecutors viewed this as premeditated. They cited his practice, the stolen weapon, the statements to his girlfriend, and the erratic accounts. Defense countered the marksman's testimony, emphasized how unlikely it was to hit a head at that distance with that old rifle. Experts described his mental capacity as deeply impaired. On trial, he was convicted of second-degree murder. He became the youngest person in American history ever convicted of murder as an adult. He was ordered to remain in a maximum security juvenile detention center until his 21st birthday, at which point he would be released if rehabilitation was satisfactory. The public reaction was intense, the case covering national news and prompting debates about juvenile justice. His mother and family protested that system failures and a total lack of appropriate mental health support had led to tragedy. Their voices highlighted how children with low cognitive functioning and unstable home lives were criminalized, not treated. Psychologically, Nathaniel's act appears to have stemmed from cognitive delay, impulsive behavior, and a profound absence of guidance, not from malice. Even so, that does not excuse what happened. He had access to a deadly weapon fired at words and actions caused the death of a stranger, and he must be held accountable. He was held accountable, but the system's treatment remains a cautionary tale. This should not evoke sympathy for the killer, but clarity about the consequences and a pressing call for better systems to help vulnerable children before tragedy strikes. The young victim lost his life. His family lost everything. Society must condemn the act firmly and also confront how a child like Nathaniel ended up committing such a crime. May viewers leave with moral clarity and resolve accountability must be clear. Victims honored and preventive supports strengthened so no child falls through the cracks again. 2. Shawn Eric Ford. At 18 years old, Shawn Eric Ford Jr. was a high school graduate living in Akron, Ohio, with no steady job to speak of. Quiet in school, he struggled with learning and speech issues from early childhood, placed on an individualized educational plan that never fully addressed his challenges. His home life was unstable, his stepfather was involved in illegal activity, and financial strain was constant. Despite mild social circles, he was not seen as dangerous before the violence erupted. A series of emotional wounds and perceived rejections set the stage. Ford had been rejected when he was not permitted to visit his girlfriend in the hospital after she was assaulted. Earlier, he had assaulted her, striking her with a brick, and then stabbing her after she rejected his advances at a gathering. That event and the swirling turmoil of anger, impulse, and humiliation appear to have ignited a destructive path. A week and a half later, in the Akron area, Ford and his 14-year-old cousin broke into the home of his girlfriend's parents by entering through a first-floor bedroom window under the cover of night. Inside, he confronted the father while the father lay and used a sledgehammer to inflict fatal trauma. Then, in a chilling continuation, Ford used the father's cell phone to send messages to the mother, impersonating a loved one, to lure her home. When she arrived, he attacked her with repeated forceful blows. The pattern and planning were clear. The cousin, alarmed by Ford's determination, later testified they blacked out during the violence. Authorities uncovered DNA evidence linking Ford to the scene along with stolen valuables. He was arrested and admitted his actions to police, acknowledging both murders, even in the face of mounting shock and grief. During the investigation and trial, forensic and psychological evaluations revealed lifelong cognitive and speech delays, placing him in a borderline intellectual range. Defense attorneys argued that those limitations, combined with his youth and emotional instability, should preclude imposing the death penalty. Despite this, a jury found him guilty of aggravated murder and related charges, unanimously recommending a death sentence for the murder of the mother. The judge concurred. He received life without parole for the father's death and a death sentence for the mother's, a ruling that appeared rooted in both the brutality of planning and the multiple victims. Public reaction was one of horror and grief. The victim families, the Schobert, were devastated. Media coverage emphasized the calculated nature of the crime and the weapon's brutality, though avoiding explicit gore. The legal system under spotlight debated where accountability meets diminished capacity. In subsequent appeals, the Ohio Supreme Court upheld the convictions but vacated the death sentence and ordered a new sentencing hearing to evaluate whether Ford's intellectual limitations disqualified him from execution under updated national standards. The court acknowledged that execution of intellectually disabled individuals violates constitutional protections, a ruling grounded in evolving diagnostic frameworks. Conviction remained, but capital punishment became legally questionable. Ford's psychological profile suggests a volatile mixture of immature coping cognitive limitations and reactive rage, not cold-blooded cruelty. Yet these factors do not absolve him. He entered the home intending violence, executed 2 murders, manipulated grieving loved ones, and killed with a weapon in a coordinated manner. That level of planning and disregard for life demands accountability. The crime shall be condemned without reservation. 2 lives were stolen, families shattered, and a community scarred. This case reminds us that emotional instability and cognitive delay can never excuse premeditated violence. Viewers should feel the weight of justice, ensuring victims are honored by truth and accountability, and should recognize the imperative to better support troubled youth before they spiral into unspeakable acts. 3. Gary Lee Graham. Gary Lee Graham was only 17 years old when he was arrested for the tragic death of a man named Bobby Grant Lambert in a Houston supermarket parking lot where an attempted robbery took place. Before that heartbreaking night, he was a teenager from a working-class Houston family that struggled with stability. He had dropped out of school, drifting through unsupervised days and accumulating a reputation among neighbors more for petty crime than violence. In the days leading up to the tragedy, Graham embarked on a week of escalating offenses. He admitted committing numerous armed robberies and assaults, and even a sexual assault, all during a brief, chaotic spree. Friends noted he had no consistent work, limited social ties, and was increasingly desperate. His emotional state and impulsive behavior appeared unstable, though no formal mental health evaluation was conducted at the time. One evening in the dimly lit parking lot of a grocery store, a man was shot dead during what appeared to be a robbery. That man was not known to Graham. He denied involvement in that killing, though he acknowledged the other violent acts. The only evidence tying him to the fatal act was a single eyewitness who claimed to have seen him for a few seconds at a distance. There was no physical evidence linking his weapon to the crime. Despite this uncertainty and his assertions of innocence, he was convicted based largely on that solitary identification. The investigation and trial raised serious concerns. Defense attorneys failed to call potential alibi witnesses and did little to challenge the credibility of the key eyewitness. Other people who knew he was elsewhere were never heard. Ballistics evidence showed the gun found in his possession did not match the murder weapon. Appeals and motions followed, and his case drew the attention of prominent civil rights leaders, including Reverend Jesse Jackson, Reverend Al Sharpton, Bianca Jagger, and others, arguing that he was a young black man with too weak a defense. Despite months of activism and legal petitions, the conviction and sentence stood. Graham, during his nearly 2 decades on death row, transformed himself. He earned his GED and a paralegal certificate, taught himself to read and write, studied philosophy and history, and changed his name to Shaka Sankofa in honor of the Zulu leader and an African concept of retrieving one's past to inform one's future. He became an advocate for others on death row, urging youth to avoid a life of crime, and founded a prison newspaper. Yet his final appeals were denied. On a sweltering summer evening, he was executed by lethal injection in Huntsville, Texas, while remaining defiant, calling his execution a legal lynching and urging his supporters to continue fighting. Psychologically, Sankofa's motivations remain complex, a mix of unaddressed emotional turmoil, systemic neglect, and perhaps even a desire for redemption. But none of that changes the fact that one man lost his life. Sankofa's case illustrates the heartbreak of a justice system that failed both the victim and a troubled teenager, shutting down avenues that might have spared lives. Today, we condemn the ravages of violence and the failures that allowed such tragedy to unfold. 2 lives were destroyed, the life of the victim and the potential that remained unfulfilled. Viewers should feel moral clarity. Accountability must stand, but so must a commitment to ensure that young lives in crisis are not discarded behind cold verdicts. Justice must be tempered by fairness, especially when a child was forced into an adult fate. 4. Napoleon Beasley. Napoleon Beasley was 17 years old when he tried to steal a Mercedes-Benz from a suburban driveway in East Texas. He was a high school senior, the president of his class, a star athlete with ambitions of law school, and a devoted member of his family and church. On the surface, he appeared noble, but beneath he struggled with the weight of conflicting identities, belonging nowhere eager for approval. His family parents, who had broken racial barriers in their community, provided love and stability, but Napoleon felt pulled between worlds, trying to be accepted everywhere and accepted nowhere. Something fractured inside him that spring. Relationships cracked, pressures mounted, and his worldview darkened. Though no formal evaluation was recorded, those closest to him later described a young man overwhelmed by anger and isolation, hungry for validation, numb to the consequences. One night, along with 2 friends from his neighborhood, he followed a middle-aged couple in a Mercedes back to their home. As they parked, Napoleon drew a gun. His companions surrounded the car. The husband, John Luttig, stepped out and uttered a single word. No, as Napoleon pulled the trigger. The bullet struck him in the garage. The wife, terrified, played dead and survived. The trio fled with the car, though it broke down, forcing them to abandon it just blocks away. The act echoed through their town, a shock that a promising youth could commit such a breakdown of trust. Neighbors and family were stunned. How could class president and honor student become a killer? A tip led investigators to Napoleon and his friends. The accomplices seeking plea deals testified against him. He was tried by an all-white jury in a case that raised troubling questions of race and fairness. He was sentenced to death, a stark and irreversible judgment for a teenager whose life until that moment had been defined by promise. The legal battle that followed was lengthy and poignant. Appeals questioned whether a minor should face execution, pointing out that he was barely 17 when the crime took place. 3 Supreme Court justices recused themselves due to their professional ties to the victim's son, a federal judge, underscoring how deeply this case reverberated through the legal establishment. In his final years, Napoleon emerged as a model prisoner. Supporters, including the trial judge, the local district attorney, legislators, and human rights advocates, urged clemency. They highlighted his youth lack of prior record and potential for change. Amnesty International and others noted that international norms prohibit executing someone for crimes committed under 18, but clemency was denied. On a somber evening, he was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville facility after his final appeals failed. As the state carried out the sentence, the nation confronted the painful tension between justice, mercy, and the limits of punishment. This cannot be excused. He took a life. The impact on the victim's family and the community is beyond measure. The crime was calculated and brutal, not a lapse in judgment, but a violent betrayal. Yet we must also reflect what failure's social-emotional communal allowed a teenager to fall so far. Let this story leave viewers with clarity. Murder must be condemned without reservation. Accountability is necessary, but we also must ask whether justice must always be blind to age, to hope, to possibility. If we are troubled by what happened, let it be a call to invest in the healing and guidance of youth before circumstances turn tragically fatal. 5. William Bosket. William James Bosket Jr. was only 15 years old when he committed 2 separate killings aboard New York City subway trains. A teenager from Harlem with no job and a troubled family history, he had been raised mostly by his mother amid instability. Though he was capable of charm and intelligence, no one foresaw the violence that would soon define his young life. Early signs of trauma shadowed his childhood. His father, a convicted murderer, was largely absent, while his grandfather, once released from prison, abused him. By age 9, Willie displayed erratic aggression, setting fires, attacking classmates, and being sent to reform schools. His behavior, left untreated and mismanaged, accelerated into a destructive spiral. One day, while riding the number 3 subway line near the Harlem 148th Street station, Willie robbed Noel Perez and shot him dead without remorse. Only 8 days later, in another attempted robbery on the same subway line by the 145th Street stop, he killed Moises Perez. Both were strangers. During those same 8 days, he also shot at a transit worker and committed other armed robberies across the system. The pattern was clear: escalating violence and detachment from human consequence. At his trial in family court, Willie surprised his attorney by pleading guilty. Despite public outrage, he could only receive a sentence of up to 5 years in a youth facility because at the time, the law limited juvenile sentencing even for murder. That leniency sparked backlash and prompted Governor Hugh Carey to call an emergency legislative session. The result was the Juvenile Offender Act of 1978, immediately allowing children as young as 13 to be tried as adults for serious violent crimes. This groundbreaking law, born of Willie Bosket's case, reshaped juvenile justice nationwide. Willie's return to society was brief. Within a year, he escaped the reform school, was recaptured, and ultimately served time in adult prisons. By his mid-20s, he had assaulted guards, set fires, attacked staff, and violently lashed out nearly every day. These infractions earned him multiple convictions and 3 consecutive adult sentences, each effectively life in length. Because of his persistent violence behind bars, New York authorities constructed a specialized cell for him, plexiglass-lined, stripped of fixtures, under constant video surveillance. He remained in near total isolation, allowed out only briefly for decades. Psychologically, Willie's motivations seem rooted in trauma and rage. In later reflections, he described himself not as innately evil, but as a creation of a system that failed him, abandoned to institutions rather than nurtured. Yet these statements do not absolve him. He took lives, terrorized strangers, and severed any chance he once had at redemption. The consequences of his actions were devastating. 2 men lost their lives. Communities were shaken. A state rewrote its juvenile laws. Society must condemn violence firmly, but also recognize where institutional neglect and unchecked harm can turn a troubled youth into a permanent threat. Viewers should leave with moral clarity. Accountability is essential, yet our justice system must do more to protect vulnerable young people before tragedy strikes. 6. Nathaniel Brazill. Nathaniel R. Brazill was just 13 years old when he fatally shot Barry Grunow, his 7th grade English teacher at Lake Worth Middle School in Florida. A middle school student with no occupation, Nathaniel had been described by teachers as mild-mannered and likable, even calling Mr. Grunow his favorite teacher. At home, however, his life was marked by instability, domestic abuse, alcohol problems, and frequent police calls shadowed his upbringing. Earlier that day, on the final day of the school year, he had been sent home for throwing water balloons. He went home, retrieved a small handgun from a family friend's dresser, and returned to campus. At the classroom door, his teacher, Grunow, refused to let him in to speak with classmates. Nathaniel pointed the weapon, tears in his eyes, and pulled the trigger. The shot struck Mr. Grunow in the head. Nathaniel later told police the weapon went off accidentally, that he didn't intend to hurt anyone. The crime shocked the community, not just for its cruelty, but for its betrayal of trust. A jury faced the choice between convicting a child of premeditated murder, second-degree murder, or manslaughter. Prosecutors portrayed Nathaniel as driven by anger, a boy hell-bent on being taken seriously. Defense attorneys painted a different picture, a momentary breakdown of judgment, not a reflection of a depraved mind. Ultimately, the jury found him guilty of second-degree murder for killing Mr. Grunow and aggravated assault for pointing the gun at another teacher. The verdict spared him a first-degree murder conviction, which would have meant life without parole. Instead, he was sentenced to 28 years in state prison, followed by an extended probation period, acknowledging both the gravity of his actions and his youth. During sentencing, Nathaniel expressed regret. In court, he admitted deep remorse and spoke of Mr. Grunow as a great man and teacher, though he maintained that the shooting was not intentional. The case ignited broader debates. Amnesty International and other human rights advocates argued that incarcerating a child for life violated international standards. The trial underscored how the justice system grapples with violent acts committed by minors. Psychologically, Nathaniel's act seems driven by emotional overload and a desperate attempt to be heard. Sorrow, neglect, and disrupted stability converged tragically at that school door. Yet trauma does not erase responsibility. A teacher was killed. A family shattered. Community trust was broken. As years passed, Nathaniel earned his GED and obtained a paralegal certification. While incarcerated, still his crime casts a permanent shadow, a reminder that even young lives can inflict irreversible pain when systems fail to intervene. We must condemn violence unequivocally. A life was taken from a devoted educator, and nothing justifies that loss. At the same time, this tragedy should spur reflection. How many vulnerable youth pushed into despair will follow a similar path if we do not act now? Let viewers leave with moral clarity, accountability without hesitation, and a sober plea to bolster our support for children before they become killers. 7. Deonte Brown. Deonte Brown was just 16 years old when he committed a devastating crime in Toledo, Ohio. A high school student with no steady job, he came from a home marked by instability. Neighbors and acquaintances described him as quiet, withdrawn, and socially distant, someone who carried a heavy weight but received little support. The trigger came when Deonte learned that his girlfriend had ended their relationship. His emotional state fractured, and the rejection seemed to ignite a spiral. His behavior in the weeks before turned brooding and erratic. There were reports he had become withdrawn at school, skipping classes and distancing himself from those who tried to reach out. One late summer evening, Deonte went to the home of his former girlfriend. In a moment driven by uncontrolled anger and desperation, he stabbed her and her younger brother. Their mother was also injured in the attack, but managed to survive. The girl died days later from her wounds. The boy succumbed on the same day. Deonte later told his mother he had done something awful, prompting a call to authorities. Investigators quickly traced the crime to Deonte. He was indicted on multiple charges, including murder, aggravated murder, rape, kidnapping, and related offenses, and was tried as an adult. Despite his youth, the court heard overwhelming evidence. He ultimately entered an Alford plea, meaning he did not admit guilt, but acknowledged that prosecutors had sufficient proof to convict. At sentencing, Deonte stood quietly as the court acknowledged the lifelong consequences of his actions. On that day, he was sentenced to life in prison without parole. The judge offered no leniency. The lives taken, the lasting trauma inflicted upon the surviving mother, and the community's loss demanded accountability without compromise. Psychologically, Deonte's actions appear rooted in emotional anguish, rejection, and perhaps untreated trauma, yet these cannot soften the verdict. A former classmate or counselor might say that heartbreak and confusion stalled into violence, but remorse does not erase the pain inflicted. In the courtroom, Deonte's mother paced the aisle, grief heavy in her eyes. The victim's mother spoke of losing 2 children in a matter of minutes, a home shattered, lifelong dreams extinguished. Her grief echoed like a quiet storm, uncontrollable, omnipresent. "Everything was taken from me in the matter of minutes," she said, naming her children, her security, her trust. This story should leave viewers with no ambiguity. Violence, especially when it claims the lives of children, demands unwavering condemnation. Deonte committed an irreversible act. The legal system held him fully accountable not because he was cruel, but because society must protect the vulnerable and uphold justice. In closing, let this serve not as a cautionary tale glorifying youth gone astray, but as a sober reflection. Emotional pain left unexamined and untreated can lead even a child to shatter lives. We must demand accountability, yes, but also commit to recognizing and intervening when vulnerability turns dark. Justice requires clarity and compassion, but never at the cost of denying the harsh reality of violent acts. 8. Raheem Lamont Cherry. Raheem Lamont Cherry was 19 years old when he committed a violent and senseless crime in Chesapeake, Virginia. A young man with no steady job, he lived in the apartment complex across the street from a wooded area where a local safety supervisor regularly parked her truck. He was known to some neighbors as unremarkable a young man passing through with no close friendships or visible purpose. That fateful morning, the victim, a 61-year-old woman from New York named Laura Miles, was stepping into her Ford pickup truck after returning from a work trip. She spoke with her husband by phone just as she opened her door, calling to confirm she was home safely. He heard a scream, and the line went dead. Moments later, her truck was found abandoned. Her body was discovered in a nearby ditch behind the local YMCA, prompting a desperate search by law enforcement and community members alike. Investigators scoured the scene and found fingerprints on the vehicle and on the victim's phone. Those prints were later connected to Raheem Cherry evidence that pointed directly toward him. A local detective had even noticed him walking in the area and briefly questioned him, though at first he was released. At trial, the prosecution laid out a sobering sequence. He had stabbed her multiple times, then abducted her in her truck before discarding her body nearby. Raheem initially denied participation. Later, he told detectives he had been coerced by a stranger who had shown him a gun and a knife. He claimed that man attacked the victim and forced him at gunpoint to help conceal the crime. The defense argued that another man was present, citing doorbell video evidence showing Raheem in the area, and then a different man in different clothes moments later. They also questioned whether Raheem's fingerprints could have ended up on the phone simply because he handled it while helping clean the vehicle, not because he committed the murder. Yet the jury was not persuaded. After 4 days of testimony and 3 hours of deliberation, Raheem was found guilty of all charges, including first-degree murder robbery, abduction, and illegal disposal of a body. In April of the following year, a judge handed down a long prison term, nearly 7 decades behind bars. Psychologically, Cherry's claim of coercion hints at fear or confusion, but the jury determined the crime was his alone to face. The victim had done nothing wrong. A devoted wife and mother, she was simply doing her job and came home safely, or so she hoped. This story leaves us without room for ambivalence. A woman lost her life in a moment she should have been safe. The crime represents a bleak intersection of opportunity violence and fate, a young man's irreversible decision that cannot be undone. May viewers conclude with moral clarity, murder must be condemned without hesitation. Accountability is paramount, especially when a life is taken in coldness and betrayal. If this narrative also inspires deeper reflection about isolation, untreated mental crisis, or community awareness, let it but first, and always let it stand as an unflinchingly sober testament to justice and grief. 9. Philip D. Chisholm. Philip D. Chisholm, 14 years old and a high school student at the time, was not just a reserved teenager. He was a soccer player, attended extra help sessions, and seemed ordinary to classmates and teachers. Raised in a stable enough family, he had moved recently from Tennessee to Massachusetts quietly, navigating a new life and a new school. He wasn't known for causing trouble. Classmates describe his behavior as somewhat withdrawn, but nothing that suggested what was to come. In the months before the crime, he showed signs of distress. Teachers noticed he was more quiet and he avoided interactions. His defense team later cited trauma-related symptoms and auditory hallucinations stretching back years. However, state experts challenged this. Psychologist Dr. Nancy Hebben administered a battery of tests and concluded he may have been exaggerating his symptoms as a way of calling out for help. Another expert doctor, Robert Kincherf, echoed this, stating that although he showed disturbance, his ability to distinguish right from wrong remained intact. On October 22, 2013, in Danvers High School, he followed his 24-year-old math teacher, Colleen Ritzer, into a bathroom. Surveillance footage later showed him stealthily entering wearing gloves and a hood and emerging with her tote bag and a recycling bin. He then maneuvered the bin containing her body into the woods behind the school before fleeing. The victim was his teacher, someone with no personal conflict, making the crime both intimate and horrifying without resorting to graphic details. A schoolmate found the bin, prompting alarm, and police were soon involved. Chisholm was found wandering beside a road in the early morning hours the next day, carrying her belongings. In the ensuing investigation, gloves, a box cutter, and other items were recovered from his backpack. Evidence included surveillance footage, the physical items, and his own statements to police. At trial, the prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of premeditation. He had brought gloves, a mask, and a weapon, changed clothes, and tried to conceal his actions. The jury found him guilty of first-degree murder, aggravated rape, and armed robbery. Despite his defense invoking psychosis and mental illness, the court ruled out expert testimony based on brain scans as too speculative and prejudicial. State experts argued he was disturbed but not legally insane, and that he understood his actions. In sentencing court, Judge David Lowy gave a sentence combining multiple counts, life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 40 years, meaning parole eligibility when Chisholm turns 54. He also imposed concurrent terms reflecting the rape and robbery convictions, ensuring he remained incarcerated. Chisholm appealed, citing legal errors, including exclusion of mental health evidence, but the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court denied bail or retrial. The unanimous decision reaffirmed his convictions and sentences, upholding the judgment and postponing any potential parole until he turns 54. Psychologically, the evidence suggests a troubled teen who may have been experiencing mental health challenges, but the legal conclusion remains decisive. He acted with awareness and control and committed acts deliberate and cruel. In closing, Philip Chisholm's crime shatters the illusion of safety in familiar places and attacks a system that trusted him. He cannot be excused by youth or inner turmoil. His actions destroyed a dedicated teacher's life, upended a family, and traumatized a community. This is not a story of sympathy. It is a warning. Justice demands accountability, especially for those who breach the most fundamental trust between student and educator. Viewers should feel the gravity of his betrayal, the depth of the loss, and the stark moral clarity that his crime deserves condemnation without mitigation. 10. Dominic Culpepper. Dominic Culpepper was 14 years old when tensions over a stolen pound of marijuana led to tragedy. A high school freshman from Sarasota County, Florida, he was not known as violent, more withdrawn and influenced by older neighborhood peers than defined by any single purpose. His home life was challenging. According to local reports, his father used him to obtain drugs and even smoked with him. That instability and easy exposure to crime set a fragile stage. Dominic's breaking point came after he learned a friend had stolen from him. Feeling betrayed and furious, he, along with 2 other teens, arranged to lure the 16-year-old victim, Wesley McCool, to Dominic's home. What began as a confrontation spiraled into a fatal speeding. Dominic grabbed a baseball bat and struck the victim repeatedly, even after the others left the room. The act was sudden, brutal, and beyond comprehension for someone his age. Neighbors called the police when they heard the attack. Investigators found the boy's body hidden in nearby woods. Dominic was immediately arrested. 2 accomplices pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in exchange for testimony. Dominic faced trial and was convicted of first-degree murder after a 2-day deliberation by the jury. He received a life sentence with no possibility of parole, as cruel as it was shocking for a 14-year-old. In subsequent years, the United States Supreme Court ruled that mandatory life sentences for juveniles violated the Eighth Amendment's prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment. This opened the door for Dominic to be resentenced. His life sentence was later reduced. He now faces approximately 40 years in prison before becoming parole eligible, a far cry from the original sentence, but still a long reckoning. Since incarceration, Dominic transformed. He earned his GED, became a certified teacher's aide within the correctional facility, leads a Bible study group, and pursues a bachelor's degree in psychology through distance learning, Turn 0, Search 4, Turn 0, Search 12. His father, Lamar Culpepper, turned this painful story into purpose, training business people and correctional staff about rehabilitation and teaching young people how to reclaim their lives. Every step Dominic has taken reflects a commitment to change, self-awareness, and redemption. Psychologically, the evidence is complex. He acted with planning and deliberation. He attacked with intent. Experts would likely observe that his adolescent brain was still incapable of full impulse control and that his unstable environment may have stunted emotional development. But those observations do not erase the reality a life was taken. Dominic's crime demands accountability. In court, Dominic himself pleaded for mercy. "I can only ask that you forgive me," he said. "If you can find it in your hearts to have mercy on me and forgive me for what I've done, I'm sorry." His remorse was profound, but the victim's family and community suffered an irreversible loss. Let this story land with sharp clarity. Dominic Culpepper committed a grave, violent act. Justice must be served, yet we must also ask where prevention failed. How do we allow a 14-year-old to spiral so deeply that a neighbor becomes prey? We must condemn the violence, uphold accountability, and also examine how emotional neglect, poor support systems, and unaddressed trauma can turn vulnerable youth into perpetrators. This is no apology for the crime, but a call to moral clarity. A life was destroyed, yes. But the tragedy also demands we do better for the next young life, teetering at the edge, looking for another path before it's too late. 11. Stephen Jared Davis. Stephen Jared Davis II was 17 years old, a high school senior from Pasadena, Maryland, when his teenage frustration turned into tragedy. He was not known to be violent, quiet, withdrawn, keeping to himself. Family members recall no signs of cruelty or aggression, only a boy who seemed distant amidst a typical suburban life. The trigger remains without clear cause and internal collapse. That morning, Stephen vanished from home along with a family vehicle. A handwritten note emerged. "Honestly, I hate y'all so much I wanted to kill y'all, but I believe one is enough to cause you enough damage." It betrayed a twisted logic and rage directed at loved ones. That same morning, his 5-year-old half-sister, Anaya Jana Abdul, was found lifeless in her bed, the victim of a brutal stabbing. Authorities traced David's cell phone and vehicle to Ohio, where law enforcement located him and pursued him in a high-speed chase. Reported speeds reached over 130 miles per hour before he surrendered. Stephen pled guilty to first-degree murder and triggered a bifurcated trial to decide his criminal responsibility, Maryland's equivalent to a formal evaluation of whether a mental disorder prevented him from understanding or controlling his actions. At trial, both prosecution and defense agreed he had mental health disorders, but disagreed whether they rendered him not criminally responsible. A jury ultimately found him criminally responsible, concluding he knew what he did and could conform his actions to the law. He was held accountable. At sentencing, Judge William Mulford noted that he directed his anger to the most vulnerable family member because she offered the most damage. He received a life sentence with all but 60 years suspended, meaning he must serve 60 years before eligibility for parole to be held at a juvenile-focused facility in Patuxent. The sentence reflects both the severity of his crime and the recognition of his youth at the time. Psychological evaluations described him as deeply disturbed, experiencing depression, isolation, and suicidal ideation. Yet experts concluded his mental illness did not explain or excuse the deliberate choice to kill his sister. Distinction underscores the court's firm stance. Mental health struggles do not shield one from the consequences of horrific actions. No sympathy can cloud the truth. This was a calculated act of familial betrayal that ended a child's life, shattered a family's safety, and shocked a community's trust. While Stephen's disturbed mental state may explain the darkness, it in no way softens accountability. Viewers should grapple with two truths. First, the cost of allowing unresolved pain, untreated depression, or hidden rage to go unaddressed. And second, the imperative for justice when the innocent pay the price. We must affirm accountability clearly, yet also ask what societal and emotional failures led a teenage boy to commit this unforgivable act, and how we might intervene sooner before another young life unravels behind closed doors. 12. Kinteri Kaiatis Durden. Kinteri Kaiatis Durden was 16 years old when two men drove to meet him in Walton County, Georgia, to complete a deal for a dirt bike he had inquired about online. He was not employed or known as dangerous, a teenager known perhaps for a troubled past, but not for premeditated violence. In the weeks leading up, Durden had shown escalating behavior. He had a juvenile record that included stealing from his grandmother, bullying classmates, and even adult crimes like stealing cars and guns. Those actions were already warning signs building toward tragedy. On a spring day, two men asking about the dirt bike let Durden into their pickup's bed where the bike rested. Driving along a rural road, Durden opened fire without warning, targeting both men in the back of their heads. The truck flipped lands upright, and Durden emerged, mounted the bike, and rode off. He showed it off to friends, lied about purchasing it, then hid it in the woods before his arrest the next day. Investigators tracked him to the scene quickly. He was charged as an adult with a sweeping set of crimes: malice murder, felony murder, armed robbery, aggravated assault, and possession of a firearm during a felony. A jury convicted him on every count after deliberating for hours. At sentencing, Judge Samuel D. Osborne, speaking by video, declared Durden irreparably corrupt and incorrigible, the only justification under Georgia law for sentencing a juvenile to life without parole. Durden received life without parole for the two malice murders. The other convictions merged with concurrent life terms. Durden offered nothing but "it's all good" as his final words, an emblem of chilling calm. Prosecutors dismissed any suggestion that the crime was impulsive or remorseful. They characterized the murders as cold, calculated proof that Durden had shown clear depravity and manipulation. District Attorney Layla Zahn argued he was beyond redemption. She cited his ability to charmingly lie as evidence he could never be trusted to change. Psychological evaluations were not detailed in publicly available sources, but the court's decision rested on the legal determination that rehabilitation was unlikely and that permitting his release would endanger society. The term irreparably corrupt is reserved for those whose crimes reflect permanent moral failure, not momentary lapse. This case shatters the myth that youth excuses brutality. 2 lives were taken based on deception and execution of the act without hesitation. A community's trust was obliterated. Viewers should feel the weight of moral clarity. Justice demanded accountability, and in this case, the justice system upheld it. There's no room here for empathy for the perpetrator. His calculated decision cost 2 men their lives. Yet we are left with a broader warning. While individuals must answer for their deeds, our society must ask how teenage anger and escalating delinquency go unchecked until they erupt into irreversible violence. Let this story leave viewers with the understanding that accountability is essential and that recognizing warning signs before tragedy strikes is our collective responsibility. 13. Isaiah Jamal Green. Isaiah Jamal Green was 19 years old when he pleaded guilty to murdering his girlfriend, Gabrielle Bolton, a young woman known for her warmth, closeness with family, and bright future ahead. He had been dating her for about a year. Their relationship was volatile. He later admitted to both mental and physical abuse during their time together. Neither his family nor the community anticipated the tragic outcome. On a late September day, first responders were summoned to a home on Jacksonville's northwest side. Gabrielle lay motionless in a back bedroom, wrapped in a shower curtain and a towel. There were clear signs of trauma. Isaiah had fled the scene, but his mother was present. She told police that her son had called her that morning saying he was upset with Gabrielle and insisting, "I didn't mean to do it." When she found them, he repeated the words and made suicidal remarks. Law enforcement later located Isaiah at a different location and brought him in for questioning. Under interrogation, he described an argument that began in the bathroom and escalated to violence. He admitted grabbing a metal object and striking Gabrielle multiple times in the head before moving her into the bedroom and covering her. Turn 0, search 0. Turn 0, search 2. Psychologically, this was not portrayed as a momentary loss of control, but as a culmination of abusive, possessive behavior. Isaiah's statements reflect both intent and detachment. He claimed not to have meant it even while carrying out repeated and lethal blows to someone he knew intimately. During his sentencing hearing, Gabrielle's parents stood to share the impact of their loss. Her father spoke of her radiant smile and beautiful heart. Her mother called Isaiah a monster, unflinchingly rejecting any notion that a loved one could be responsible for such violence. When our children are little, we are always telling them there are no such things as monsters. She said this is a lie. Isaiah appeared, muted his final words to the court, simply affirming, "I didn't mean to do it." The judge imposed a sentence of 50 years in Florida State Prison, a term reflecting both the gravity of the crime and the need for accountability. This case poses difficult truths. While Isaiah's remorse phrases appear heartfelt, they cannot erase the fact that he physically assaulted and killed someone who trusted him. His crime cannot be softened by regret alone. As a society, we must hold perpetrators fully accountable. This case demands clarity. Violence, even from someone close, is never acceptable. Justice requires that personal remorse does not replace responsibility. We also must consider the warning signs that often precede such tragic outcomes: patterns of abuse, threats, emotional volatility. It is vital to intervene to offer support and consequences before anger becomes forever destructive. Above all, this narrative should not instill sympathy for the perpetrator, but rather moral clarity. Gabrielle Bosset's life ended in a violent moment of betrayal. Let viewers feel the urgency of preventing such tragedies, from recognizing danger earlier to ensuring justice remains unwavering.